Hi, everyone. Oh, great. I'm Maria Johnson, and I'm so happy to be a part of today's Future with Hope conference. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to wait here for just a couple of minutes to make sure that everybody gets in. And hopefully, everything will be terrific for us. I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about my faith journey and also about my favorite devotion, Our Lady of Charity. So we'll just wait just a few minutes, make sure everybody can get in, and we'll be ready to go. As I sit here and wait, I don't know if you can hear in the background, the Angelus bells are playing. And so that's always a beautiful way to start a conversation about Mary with the Angelus bells. This morning, Melanie Rigney opened and talked about what we could expect for the rest of the day. And I already listened to the first talk with Allison Gingras, and it was just a lovely way to share our faith. And it's a great place to be in our lives now, especially in a conference such as this for women who are 40 plus, women of a certain age like me. And it's just beautiful to be enjoying this season of our lives. So why don't we go ahead and get ready? I like to start in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and just call upon the Holy Spirit to open my heart and give me the words perhaps to nestle sweetly in your heart. Amen. So I'd like to start today by actually just doing a show and tell. If we were at the conference live, then I would probably have some slides with lots of pictures of my adventures. But for today, I think I'm just going to bring in a couple of things to show you. And one of those things is Our Lady of Charity, which is one of my favorite little images and one of my favorite devotions. So we're going to be talking about this devotion in a little while, but let's talk about how I got there. All right, because this is about celebrating this season of our lives. And one of the things that I really have to just come clean with is that I wasn't always a faithful practicing Catholic. In fact, I had probably about a decade or more where I had become not just tepid in the faith, but had walked away from it. And so I hope that by sharing my story with you today, that you can see that perhaps, we all don't come at the faith in the same way or at the same time or even with the same level of devotion. But everything has a time and a season, and so here we are, and I'll tell you my story. Today happens to match two very neat things that are happening in October. One is that, back to show and tell, it's the month of the Rosary. And also, it happens to be Hispanic Heritage Month. And so it's a neat thing for me to be able to touch on both of those topics for you today because they are both close to me. In my personal story, I was born in Cuba in the early 1960s, well past the time that the Cuban Communist Revolution had taken over the country, and in addition to the totalitarian nature of such a regime, we also have the situation that it's an atheist regime, and so there was also religious persecution happening at that time. And so my personal story is being born into a faithful Catholic family. And at that time, my parents were married pretty quickly in order to be able to secure a visa for my father to come to the United States. And they were married in the church, and he came to the United States with the hopes of finding a job and getting an apartment and bringing my mother over. Unfortunately, as things happen, the country became shut down. There were no more exit visas issued sometime after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, I think it was. At any rate, my parents were separated, and unbeknownst to them, my mother was pregnant with me. So it took them several years to be able to get both my mother and me here to the United States. And it's a long, crazy story of petitions for visas, entries into other countries with no exits. But, you know, it's an immigrant story that is unique to us, but plays across so many families, not just from Cuba and from Latin America, but throughout the whole world, that people want to seek freedom, and that they want to seek, in many cases, religious freedom. And so here I was, this little toddler, and my mother, and I traveled first to Mexico, where we were in Mexico City. And you know what's beautiful, one of the beautiful things about midlife is how you can look back on your life and see the hand of God weaving the story. And you can also see, if you have a strong devotion to Mary, how Mary is there. So here I was in Mexico City, probably blocks from Our Lady of Guadalupe. And we waited in Mexico for several months before we were able to come to the United States. And so we were reunited beautifully on my father's birthday. So here I am now, a new immigrant to the United States, and we're kind of holding on, as most immigrants do, to our traditions and to those things that we know. And of course, one of those things was our faith, that we were now able to practice freely in the United States, and my mother's devotion and my father's devotion to Our Lady of Charity. Our Lady of Charity is the patroness of Cuba, and she's one of the many, many titles of Mary, and she has a unique story that I will be sharing with you today. But let's go on with my life. So I was raised within a nice 3-child, 2-parent, 1-dog household. I went to Catholic schools. I attended Christ the King Elementary School, shout out to the Lions, and started attending St. Pius X High School in Atlanta, but we eventually moved to Miami from Atlanta, and I finished at a local high school there, and then went on to college there, where I met my husband, doing some public service. We were answering phones at the Jerry Lewis Telethon in Miami, and that's how we met. So from there, I really just kind of started very slowly easing my way away from the faith. And, you know, I think that this is a common story, and I think it's important to talk about, because not only does it happen to us in some cases, but, you know, also for our children. And so it's very important for us to keep in mind that our task as parents is to pray for our children. And hopefully for those of us who have children who fall away from the faith, to pray them back into the faith. I know this for a fact because that was my particular case. I fell away from the faith, as I said, for about a decade. And my parents prayed me back into the church. And so I was married, as I said, I was married in the church. My husband and I were able to travel rather extensively. He was in the military and we were stationed overseas. And I had some beautiful experiences in Europe because of it. And then we returned to the United States and started a family. And so our daughter came along, and then another daughter, and then a son. And so we have 3 grown children now, and I'm enjoying being a grandparent too, which is a beautiful, beautiful part of my life. But the question is, well, where's the faith in this? I have to be honest and say that I was not attending church. It was after that we had our children that I realized, well, if we are going to raise our children in the faith, then it's time for us to get back and become active once again. And so it has been a very slow conversion for us. And that, we went back and did the baptism classes to make sure that our children were baptized. And it wasn't until our oldest daughter went her sacrament prep for First Communion, that she encouraged through her own example and her own enthusiasm for me especially to return to the sacraments and to return to the sacrament of reconciliation, to go back to confession and to go back and be in communion with the church. And so for that, I'm very grateful, because it was a child that led me back into the faith. And it was some years later, that same child who at a retreat for, pardon me, at a retreat in high school, learned how to make twine rosaries. And I was already interested in returning to a prayer life. And in this retreat, she learned how to make all twine rosaries through Rosary Army. So if you guys are not familiar with the Rosary Army, what they do is they teach about the faith, and they teach especially about the rosary by making all twine rosaries. And I don't have one with me, because part of their motto is to make them, pray them, and give them away. And every time I make a twine rosary, I give it away. But I do have my current rosary. I don't know if you're like me, but I go through these phases of wanting a particular kind of feel in my hand for a rosary, and I have this very heavy rosary that is my go-to now. But it was through a rosary that I was really reintroduced, or perhaps a different way of looking at it is that for the first time in my life, I really understood the prayers of the rosary, and especially the meditation on the mysteries. So that was very, very special for me. And I started to pray that rosary, and praying every day. And what happened is that it wasn't just that I fell in love with Mary and fell in love with her son Jesus, because Mary always leads us to her son, but that I really began to embrace my faith and to embrace what that means in my life and what that means in the life of my family. And so that was a really important element for me to have really reverted to the faith through the rosary. And it was a very beautiful experience for me. And so what's interesting also about that is that I had always wanted to be a writer. And I had been writing for many, many years. Short stories, poetry. I'd even started a novel or two. I even wrote, don't try to look it up, but I even wrote what was a terrible, terrible science fiction novel that I tried my hand on. But I had never really enjoyed any kind of success with that. I mean, I knew it was a gift that the Lord had given me with words, and to be able to write and to enjoy the work that I was doing. But it was just a crazy, crazy inability to make a mark with my writing. And at about that time, I had started to make rosaries through the Rosary Army folks, and maybe you know them, Greg and Jennifer Willits and Rosary Army. And I encourage you, if you love the Rosary or want to know more about it, to seek them out at rosaryarmy.com. And find out what it is that we do in making and praying and giving away those rosaries. But it was through that organization that I really started to realize that I could use my gift, if not to be writing a best-selling novel, to at least use this gift that God gave me for His kingdom. And Greg was very generous and said, why don't you come on and see if you want to do a little post every week on the website. And so I did, and I started to blog, and I started to share what was at the time my growing faith and my love of the Rosary and the love of Mary and Jesus, to start sharing that with folks. And so over time, I really became encouraged that this is perhaps what I'm supposed to be doing, is this gift that has been given to me by God can be returned to Him and to the kingdom. And so I just fell in love with writing. And that led to some other exciting things that I was able to do. And here's the thing, folks. When you think about us as writers, when you follow Catholic writers or you buy our books, thank you for supporting that. It's work that we do for you to help you along on your path to in your spiritual journey. But also, if you think about it a different way, it is growth for us as speakers. It's growth for us as writers to be sharing this, because we do our research and we get deeply involved in a lot of the things that we are writing about and talking about. And so, I might write a book that might touch your hearts, or perhaps you're listening to me today and there's something that I say that touches your heart, but so much of it is for my growth too. And so it's a beautiful way to share the faith, because it becomes interactive, which is why this is a little awkward, because I'd really love to be hearing what you have to say and what your comments are and seeing your reaction. But this is also a great venue for you to have access to something that you might not have done before. But anyway, here I am starting to be confident in sharing my faith with others and what that might mean. And I'm writing for a Rosary Army, and I encounter some other places. I ended up through Greg and through Jennifer working through the StarQuest production network. You may follow them. They have terrific podcasts on lots of things in the culture. So if you're like me and you like science fiction or you like the movies, they have lots of great content there. And I became involved in a Harry Potter podcast that was led by Father Roderick von Hogen, who was in the Netherlands. And that became a way to look at the culture and see what was going on in the culture and say, well, where are the seeds of the gospel in these things that we're doing and that we're seeing? Can we watch a movie and find that it has a good message for us? Can we listen to music and hear the seeds of the gospel in that? And so that's a wonderful organization that seeks those seeds of the gospel in the culture, and then they discuss it on podcasts. And I was so blessed to be a part of that organization for many years, and to really learn how to find people where they are and talk about the faith that way. And so it was on one of those podcasts, Catholic Weekend, where my panelist friends that were talking about their confirmation saints, and at that time I was like, well, my situation, having been born in a communist country that was atheist, was a little difficult, because I was baptized, but there was not going to be an availability of sacraments, for a very long time, and so I was confirmed almost immediately. So I was confirmed as an infant, and that was not a difficult situation. I mean, in the old church, you received all three of the sacraments at the same time. You were baptized, confirmed, and had your first communion all at once. So for me, I had to learn about the sacrament that I had received when my classmates were being confirmed when I was in 5th grade. And so at that time, Sister just sat me aside while they were practicing walking up and down in the church and said, why don't you just read about the saints? And I think that was really the first time that I was introduced to the exciting lives of the saints. But here I am, almost 50 years old. This was 10 years ago almost. And we're on this podcast, and my colleagues, my companions, are all discussing their confirmation saints, and I was just sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to turn 50 next year, and I don't have a confirmation saint. I can't talk about anything like this with you guys. And it was one of the funniest adventures I've had, because everyone turned to me and was like, what? Just pick a saint. What do you mean? Just pick a saint that's going to be your patron saint. So I said, well, okay, I'll do that for my 50th birthday. I'll research the saints, and I'll try and figure out who's going to be this person that's going to be my patroness. and or patron, right? So I spent a year in study, and I had narrowed it down to two possible saints that were going to be my companions in life. And it was St. Catherine of Siena, because I thought that she was some woman that would kind of go waggle her finger at a pope and tell him to get his act in gear. And the other one was St. Teresa of Avila. So I told you we were going to have show and tell. I have this beautiful little icon of St. Teresa of Avila that was a gift from a friend, and she's the one who I ultimately picked. Now, why would I pick St. Teresa of Avila? Well, it turns out that I had a very big connection in my family to St. Teresa of Avila. My mother, my two aunts, and my mother-in-law were all educated in Cuba under a Carmelite order there. So St. Teresa has been in my life from the beginning, always. And to be honest with you, I didn't have a great relationship with her. Once we had moved to Miami, I found that every time that the Teresians were having a reunion for their students, my mother would drag me along to show me off to her friends and to bring me along for these luncheons and reunions. So I harbored a little bit of resentment about St. Teresa. And so I actually spent my whole life, right up until that year that I was studying her, kind of avoiding St. Teresa of Avila, precisely because I didn't understand her and I didn't know anything about her. And then here's the amazing conversion that I had that year. I read that we have so many things in common. First of all, she's a doctor of the church precisely because of her writings. And I'm currently rereading, and it's almost like I'm reading it for the first time, Interior Castle, which is a great suggestion that I have for you. I find her writing to be very natural. I was kind of afraid of her at first, thinking that maybe she was going to be esoteric and deep because, my goodness, she's a doctor of the church. But the truth is that I find her very relatable, and so I was kind of pleased that I had discovered this about her. But primarily the thing about St. Teresa that has drawn me is that she had a pretty tepid faith life. In fact, she joined the Carmelites mostly to find some security. She didn't want to get married, and so she saw that as an opportunity for her to have a comfortable, or at least a regular kind of life for herself. And it was only much later into her late 40s that she had a deep and profound conversion. So I thought, wow, this is a really good match for me. One of the things that I really love about encountering the saints and discovering them and reading about their lives is how thoroughly human they are, and how we are made of the same stuff. You know, we have our faith life and our journeys that are unique to us, but so did the saints. And so sometimes I think of the saints and I put them on a pedestal of piety, and in truth they were regular people like us. And so I found a great simpatico with Saint Teresa of Avila, to have a connection with her. And so Saint Teresa truly became my patron and truly became my friend as I read more about her, read more of her works, and really got to understand how we need to work in our faith daily, and we need to take steps that sometimes are just, being persistent and persevering, and other times that it's okay to push ourselves and to challenge ourselves to try something new and something better. That's how I found my praying the Rosary led me to a consecration to Jesus through Mary many years later. And if you haven't done the St. Louis de Montfort consecration, which I attempted a couple of times in my life at different times, and ultimately became distracted and gave up. Sometimes very early, and sometimes almost halfway through the consecration. But I found that Father Gately's 33 Days to Morning Glory worked for me and got me through that first consecration. And since then I've reconsecrated and done the St. Louis de Montfort one. But it was, like I said, a challenge and really an exercise in perseverance. So now I have found myself, approaching this new stage of my life. I was a college professor and I retired early, and have dedicated myself to a little bit more writing and to more ministry, and it led to my writing my very first book. Now I've got some copies of my books here. I feel like I'm doing an infomercial, and I don't want that to be that way at all. This is my story, and this is the work that I do. So I wrote this book, and I can't ever keep a copy of it with me. So this is the advanced reading copy that I got from the publisher. But I wrote my Badass Book of Saints some years ago, about 5 years ago, and as I told you, I had changed my writing. I had changed from writing fiction and trying to break into the secular market to writing for God and for the kingdom. And so one day I had been forwarding on Facebook all of the saint, stories of the day or interesting articles, as we all do here. And I had found an interesting article on the canonization process for Sister Blandina Segale, who had been a sister working in education and helping to build schools and hospitals out west. And I found her story so fascinating that I talked a little bit about her on Facebook, and it got me connected to my editor, Heidi, who says, well, I think that you can turn this into a book. And so that was my first book, my Badass Book of Saints. And it's got a beautiful cover and a lovely collection of saints and interesting women that I found were really fascinating women of honor and integrity, and that they were doing some exciting things, not all of them necessarily Catholic. But I thought, if these are women who have such extraordinary strength and have such amazing human virtues, well, what happens when we allow grace to work within us? What happens when we, open ourselves to God and open ourselves to His love and sharing that love with others? What happens when grace moves within us? Well, it creates heroic virtue in us, and that's really what the saints did. And so I pair these exceptional historic women with some exceptional and amazing saints. Well, who is the first saint that I talk about in that book but Saint Teresa of Avila? And in the course of writing the book, I discovered lots of other saints, of course, that I share with my readers. But I end that book with my devotion to Our Lady of Charity. So we're going to come back full circle now. A little bit of Hispanic heritage coming in here at this point. At that point in my life, I had really just gone full in on my Marian devotion. I had recently finished my consecration, and I thought, well, I think that the greatest saint for us to really look to is, of course, Mary as the ultimate model for our behavior and for our human virtue. And so I wrote about Our Lady of Charity. Well, at that time, the most extraordinary thing happened. Pope Francis was going to visit Cuba. He was going on his apostolic trip in 2015. And I had asked my publisher if there was any chance that I could have a hardbound copy of the Galleys. The book was going to be coming out later that fall, and I was going to Cuba in September to be a part of the Pope's visit to Cuba. A little full disclosure here. One of my uncles is a bishop in the diocese where the story of Our Lady of Charity begins. And so I thought it was really amazing that, number one, that I would have an opportunity to return to Cuba 50 years almost to the date of my having left, but that I would be right there so close to the National Shrine of Our Lady of Charity in Cuba that I would have an opportunity to visit. Now, these are these tiny little things that are the desires of my heart that I keep inside my heart, and I don't, it wasn't something that I was necessarily praying about, or it was just like this hope that I had, but that I wasn't really doing very much about. But I think Mary had some other ideas. I think that Mary wanted me not only to reunite with my family in Cuba that I had not seen since I left 50 years ago, but also that I should return and see my place of birth, and to return on this pilgrimage, which amazingly, the title of the Pope's visit to Cuba was Missionary of Mercy. And so I thought that that was a beautiful connection as well. So here I am with this particular advanced copy of this book, and I had a couple of copies of those, and I put them in my baggage, and I thought maybe, I don't want to ask, I don't want to impose on anyone, but maybe I'll have an opportunity to go to the shrine. So we went and we traveled to Cuba with my mother and her two sisters. So it was four of us traveling to Cuba, and we arrived in Holguin, which is where the Bay of Nipe is, and we met with family. We got together. We had a lovely outdoor mass, as the Pope, usually does in his visits. And then we had a private audience with the Pope. And that was a beautiful experience. And all of my mother's siblings were together, and we have a beautiful picture of that event. And then I thought, okay, well, that's the end of that. We got to meet the Pope, and we were going to have some beautiful family time afterwards. But when the Pope left, my uncle said, well, okay, well, let's go on our pilgrimage now. And I was like, what? And we went down to the shrine. We saw the copper mines. We went to the basilica. We had a private tour of the basilica. And one of the unusual things that happened is that the statue of Our Lady of Charity, which is in the basilica, housed in a glass case above the altar, had been brought down because Pope Francis's custom is that he takes flowers to Marian shrines, and so he had taken flowers to Our Lady of Charity for the Mass that he celebrated there at the basilica. And so we were there at the altar, had an opportunity to pray a family rosary right there together with my mom and her siblings, my aunts and uncles, and me, and it was just gorgeous. And so we were kind of looking around, and we were all kind of in our own little world, walking around the basilica and enjoying the beauty of it. And the rector was there, and I asked him, I said, do people bring gifts to Our Lady here? And he says, all the time. My job is to collect them and catalog them, and we have a room in the basement where they're housed. And I said, could I give Our Lady of Charity the gift of my book that she really had a big part of in inspiring and accompanying me, and I had that whole chapter dedicated to her. And I thought, oh my goodness, what an experience. And he said, yeah, just put it on the altar. And I was like, okay. So I put it on the altar, and then I stood back, and he said, okay. And I said, well, do I clean up after myself? What do I do here? And he says, no, that's my job. I'll put it away and catalog it. And so these are these little gifts that our Lord gives us, and that Mary has a hand in, I think, because here I was as a young girl wanting to be a writer, and now this priest was telling me that this book that I wrote and that I had dedicated to Our Lady of Charity was going to be cataloged and put in with other literary gifts. Now, I started thinking about that. I'm a teacher of literature. My humble little book is housed in the same place that Ernest Hemingway has his Nobel Prize for Literature, because he returned to the shrine and offered that to Our Lady of Charity. So, I mean, the kisses that we get from heaven when we have such an open faith, I think are they're just little treats that come along. And so I thought that I'd share that anecdote with you because it's really neat. So anyway, I returned to the United States. It was a wonderful trip, a beautiful opportunity, not only just to be led on pilgrimage by the bishop of the area and also my uncle, but it was also a connection to my family and to my heritage, which was a lovely opportunity to share in that with my family. Well, I returned to the United States, and at this time, you know, the book had come out, and it was getting good traction, and I was enjoying writing, and I had an opportunity to write another book, which was Supergirls and Halos, and that was a lot of fun. It was the same idea as the Badass book. I was able to look at not living women who were historical figures, but at the superheroes that we so much love in our culture, like Wonder Woman and Hermione Granger and Dana Scully, but also with the saints, and to pursue what I had kind of started in that first book, which is looking at these connections in our culture. But my experience with having gone to the shrine of Our Lady of Charity and having walked in those footsteps of those men who had found the statue had really just opened up in me a fascination with and a great desire to share the story of this devotion that has not just impacted a nation, but I think it has such amazing relevance in our world today. And so at this end of this talk is what really I want to share with you the story of Our Lady of Charity and who she was, and why that devotion is something that you would love to pursue today. And I wrote about it in this book, and this is why actually Melanie had wanted me to share with you this book, Our Lady of Charity, how a Cuban devotion to Mary helped me grow in love and faith, is a spiritual memoir, and it tells the story of my trip to Cuba, my return to the place of my birth, my reconnection, not just with my Cuban roots, but also with my faith roots because of Our Lady of Charity. So I want to share with you the story, and I want you to look at this image, and I'm going to return to it in a moment, but I want you to see what's happening here. So there's this huge image of Mary holding the child Jesus in her arms and holding a cross in her hand, and then these three men down here at the bottom. The two men on the opposite ends of the boat are brothers, and the man in the middle, in this particular image, is displayed like a grown man, but was actually a little boy who may have been about 10 years old. And so this story is recounted in the church history at the time, because that boy's name, Juan Moreno, was interviewed much later by the Catholic authorities, by the church authorities, to make sure that that they got the record straight. So let's go back about 400 years to Cuba in the early 1600s. The Spaniards had come and had established a colony in Cuba, and on the easternmost part of the island was a copper mine that was developed by the colonists, and they employed for labor the local Indians, who were the Native Americans of Cuba, who were maybe the Simone, or they were the Arawak tribe of Indians there. And they were not enslaved, but it was a forced labor. And I think it's important to discuss and to acknowledge this period of history, because they also brought African slaves to work in the copper mines. And so this boy, Juan Moreno, was an African boy, or of African descent. And the two brothers, who were of Indian descent, had taken him to the Bay of Nipe to teach him how to gather salt from the salt marshes. And it was while they were out in the bay that they encountered a storm, and they became very frightened. And they turned to Mary and asked for her intercession to save them from this storm in the bay. And what happened is that the storm calmed, and everything settled down for them. And once the waters were calm, they felt something hitting the side of the boat, and they looked over. Maybe it was a canoe, and they looked over the side, and they found that there was a statue that was floating in the water, and the statue was tied to the board, and on the board it said, "I am Our Lady of Charity," in Spanish, "Yo soy la Virgen de la Caridad." Well, this image that we have of Mary is what tells that story. This was not an apparition. Mary did not appear to them like we know in the story of Fatima, for example, or in Our Lady of Guadalupe's story. In this particular case, this was strictly the men's faith, that they had called upon Mary, and they were saved from the storm, and it was the statue that appeared afterwards that was miraculous, because what was unusual is that the statue was not wet. So they marveled at that, and they brought it onto their boat, and it's a small statue. It's maybe a foot tall, and they brought it back to land, and they knew immediately that it was miraculous. And so they built a tiny little shrine, with the local wood and palm fronds and what was available to them. And they set up this little shrine, and they began to venerate Our Lady there. And of course, that story, it went, to use a word today, it went viral, but certainly by word of mouth in those days. And what happened is that the church authorities wanted to know more about it, and so the statue was moved to other places, but it always disappeared in the night and made its way back to where the men had originally built that little shrine. Well, eventually devotion to Our Lady of Charity grew and grew and grew, not just through the region, but as people began to be more and more devoted to this title of Mary, that she was taken to, the statue was taken down to Santiago, was taken down to where the copper mines were, and it was put in, first it was put in the chapel in the copper mines, and then it was moved into a church that burned down, and then finally in the early part of the 20th century they built that basilica, and they put that statue there. But the veneration for Our Lady of Charity had just grown through the centuries, and at the early part of the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s, in the United States we know it as the Spanish-American War, but for Cubans it was the War of Independence from Spain. The revolutionaries from that time, called Mambises, had called upon Mary to be their patroness in that period, and the veterans of that war eventually later on had written to Pope Benedict at that time, 15th, in 1914, 1915, in that era, had written to him to make her officially the patroness of Cuba. And so that's the story of Our Lady of Charity. Now, why do I think that she's such an amazing title of Mary for us to venerate Mary under? And that is that she comes to us in all our storms, in the storms of our lives. she is there to hear us and to help bring us to safety. So I hope that you give her a chance, and that you learn more about Our Lady of Charity. I'd love for you to pick up the book, and what I can do is I encourage you to go to my website, mariamjohnson.com, and I have the book available there if you'd like to purchase it, or you can get it through Amazon if you'd like. But if you can buy it straight from me, I'd be happy to autograph it for you. So that information's on my website. But I also invite you to go there and sign up for my newsletter, and I'll be giving away 5 copies of the book for those people who sign up new. But anyway, it's been a pleasure sharing with you. It's a devotion for our time. It's a devotion for the turmoil and the storm that we're facing today, and I just invite you to learn more about her. So it looks like my time is up. So I think I can hang around for a couple of minutes, maybe look and see if I can see where the questions are. If anybody is, oh, I can't see anything. We're using this software. Well, I encourage you to come back at 3 o'clock and listen to Melanie Rigney's talk. And then at 3:45, I'll be joining Melanie and Allison for a chat there. And I'll be happy to answer your questions there, or in the next couple of minutes, I'll probably hang around in the chat box and see if I can answer some of your questions directly there. But it's a pleasure participating in this great day. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I hope that you come back later and talk with us again. God bless you.